I'm going to show you the game between Paco Vallejo from Spain and Magnus Carlsen from round 2 of the Grenke Chess Classic. Remember, if you want to subscribe to the channel, then click on the button below, and if you want to support the channel, then check out the links to PayPal and Patreon.com in the video description. On with the game. So Carlsen with the white pieces, playing Vallejo, very experienced grandmaster from Spain. How would Carlsen fare after playing for 7 hours, or almost 7 hours, against Vincent Keimer in round 1? Would he have the energy to give his best? So we've got a very theoretical position on the board. Spanish, of course, and Carlsen playing quite a sharp line with the early bishop c5, which invites white to play d4. Now, Carlsen has done this before against Karyakin. We'll see how that game went in a moment. The critical move here is bishop g5, pinning, because with that bishop away from e7, then that pin is quite serious. And, well, there have been a lot of games played in that line. Tiles played it, for example, a long time ago. But Vallejo played pawn takes e5. And now here is where Karyakin played queen d5, and that led actually to an endgame quite quickly after this, which Carlsen had obviously analysed in great detail, and well, he made a draw pretty comfortably. So Paco played here bishop c2 instead. It's not a huge improvement. This also leads to liquidations after this. And you can see that with a virtually symmetrical pawn structures, there could be a lot of trades in this position. So from a theoretical point of view, Carlsen has come out of the opening absolutely fine. Is there enough juice in the position for him? That's another question if he wants to play for a win. So bishop g5 provokes a little weakness perhaps with f6. But black is pretty solid here. Here Carlsen makes a very interesting decision. He could just tuck his king out of the way. That's been played before. But he plays g5. So that's already an indication that he wants to try and, stir up trouble in this position. Try and get an unbalanced position. So if the bishop comes back to g3, then f5. So Vallejo took on d6, and Carlsen went for an endgame. So this is slightly damaged black structure, but it's not such a big deal. And you'll notice this bishop now has no opponent. There's no dark square bishop that can possibly exchange that off. And it's this bishop that Carlsen is going to try to bring into the game somehow. Let's see how he does that. So knight d2. Well, you could play here, for example, d5. Then after knight b3, that knight could sit, one of the knights will sit very nicely on d4. I'm not saying that white has the advantage here, but it's a solid way to play. Be more difficult for black to generate anything in this position. So instead of that, Carlsen pushed with g4, which rather splits these kingside pawns, but it means that white doesn't have that kind of anchor on d4 in the middle of the board. So it's just a way of sort of unbalancing the position, but it means that black's pawns on the king side are pretty ugly. So black has to play very precisely here, actually. But Carlsen's quite good at that. d4, liquidating that isolated pawn. And if there is a big exchange on this square, then that bishop could come into play here. So that's a logical move, d4. But still, there are a lot of weaknesses in black's position. And that knight, well, Carlsen decided he didn't want to leave it there. He took that off. So we've got opposite coloured bishops now. Black's pawns on the kingside still a bit ragged, and now that h-pawn advancing, is this pawn advance weak or strong? Let's find out. Rook d1. So everything pretty even so far. With opposite coloured bishops, of course, if there are a lot of exchanges, the rooks in particular, then this could inevitably lead to a draw. But no exchanges so far. Now this is an interesting moment. Carlsen decides to advance again. And he brings his king up the board. Now, if you're going to advance your pawns here, then the king does not sit well on the back rank somewhere. It really needs to join these pawns to support them. But of course, this entails some risk. Black has to make absolutely sure that the king is safe. And yeah, a rook check is allowed, but the king does seem to be pretty safe on g5 at the moment. g3. And now Carlsen exchanges on c3 and exchanges rooks. And finally it's time to bring this queen's rook properly into the game. And now we can see what Carlsen's strategy is about. So he's pressing with his kingside pawns. And actually he wants to combine rook and bishop to attack white's king, which is getting squeezed on the king side. And he's hoping that white won't be able to grab pawns on the other side of the board. This knight could prove to be offside on a5 if Carlsen can seize the initiative. f4, well, yes, if white doesn't play f4, you can see this bishop is attacked. If the bishop moves and the rook is able to come down to d2 with the potential advance of the h-pawn, possibly f-pawn as well, then the king could be squeezed here. So f4 check, an interesting move. Carlsen admitted afterwards he'd kind of underestimated this move. In fact, black is fine here. It's even possible to sacrifice knight for 2 pawns because white's king is still a little bit squeezed here, and the rook and bishop are very active. But Carlsen took on f3, there's nothing wrong with this, and continued his press on the king side. Well, obviously there was a threat for white to play h4, so that prevents that. But of course black wants to make this move anyway to weaken the g3 pawn. The knight returns into the middle, preventing a rook coming down here. An exchange, and now bishop b8. So that bishop switching diagonals, targeting the pawn here. And now b5. So lots of pawn exchanges. Normally you'd think this should lead to a draw, and it should do here. Here, well, Vallejo was running short of time, and he played, you could say, the natural move, which is to bring the knight back towards the king side. In fact, knight a3 should force a draw, but it's counterintuitive to put the knight so far away from your king, from your other pieces. I mean, black can try various things, but it's not good enough. But knight e3, it still doesn't look bad. Check. So the rook is activating, and there's an awful lot of material on this third rank. So rook d3 looks like a very natural move. Now bishop c6 should probably be played, but how one divines this in time pressure or even when one has a lot of time is another matter. Vallejo played a very natural move, bishop e2, and exchanged pawns. But f4 manages to keep white under pressure in this position. Obviously an exchange will allow a fork, knight fork there, king and rook. Bishop e8 played, attacking the knight, which goes back to attack the rook. So the rook is attacked, the knight is attacked. So white has to play rook b6, attacking that bishop. So white is hanging on in there at the moment. So pawn takes knight, rook takes bishop, and the black rook can, if necessary, come back to stop the pawn advancing to the queening square. So bishop e5. They have reached the time control at move 40, but still white is not quite there yet. Rook c6. Obviously an exchange of rooks would just be a draw. Very quickly white would be able to take the pawn. So Carlsen keeps the rooks on the board. And here Vallejo just waits with rook b6. In fact, rook c4 will draw the game. Now this is very tricky. Really difficult move actually, because in this position, once black's knight enters the game, this looks really worrying. And in this position, white has to play really precisely. I think particularly when there are loose pieces and the king is in danger. Also the rook generally doesn't work too well when it's very close to other pieces. Normally, the rook looks like it should be here, for example, hassling the king. In fact, this is good enough to draw. After knight f4, the king is just about safe enough on h4. And after this, check. Well, king h4 in this case would be disastrous, but the king can step back. And here's the trick. This looks absolutely fatal. You can see 3 black pieces hitting the knight, but incredibly, this move still draws. After king f6, you can take and, for example, and that position is a draw. So already it's study-like if white can actually hold this draw. Very difficult to see. Rook b6 played. Rook a2. And now rook b4. The knight comes in. I check. And this one is a little bit different. Now here is, again, one of those situations where it is so difficult to make the correct decision. I was looking at this position with a table base. So that gives you the definitive answer on whether these endgames with just a few pieces are a win, draw, loss. So in this position, knight takes pawn. According to the table bases, this wins for black. But if white plays rook takes and plays this one with rook and knight against bishop and knight, according to the table bases, this is a draw. I still think this would be very, very difficult to hold in practice with rook and knight against bishop and knight. But that's what the table bases play. So next time you've got this position and yeah, you want to go for the draw, then keep black's knight on the board. There we go. Very difficult to hold though. Vallejo played bishop c6, and after g2, this forces this endgame with opposite coloured bishops. Obviously, this position, once we get something like this, this is certainly losing. White's king is in desperate trouble there. That's going to be a win. So white took here, and we've got this position. And Carlsen said after the game he was pretty sure that this is a theoretical win, but he wasn't sure whether he had 50 moves in order to win the game, or whether it was one of those positions where you have an exception and you're given 75 moves. But actually, that showed he didn't know the full rules of chess, because a few years ago all these endgames were standardized so that now it's only 50 moves. These exceptions for some endgames having 75 moves, they've been done away with. All the endgames are now 50 moves in which to checkmate if there's no capture or no pawn move. But he during the game he asked the arbiter. He wasn't sure. According to the table bases, this is with best play from both sides. This is mate in 54. So with best play for both sides, actually it could still be a draw. But of course, in practice, neither side is going to be able to play this kind of position perfectly. It's notable that this bishop that Carlsen has nurtured right from the beginning, this bishop with no opponent, is actually the star of the show here. And it shows that positions with opposite colour bishops are very difficult for the defensive side. Rook and bishop are a very strong partnership. Okay, let's see what happened. So the knight came back. Now, this is good defence because you can see the knight controls dark squares and the bishop controls the light squares. So they're creating a kind of barrier preventing black's king from breaking through. But this defence can be shaken. Let's have a look. I mean, it just so happens that white's king is in a pretty bad position. It's already very close to the back rank, and this already looks absolutely desperate, and it is a definite win. Apparently rook d2 check is the best move here according to the table bases, but Magnus started a shuffle with the king. Basically, I think he wants to go all the way around here. That's where he's aiming, d3, to try and trap the king and get a checkmate. But it's not so simple. So the king continues on its journey, and rook d2 check, king e1. Now here, king d5 is mating 55, apparently. The rook came back, and after this, bishop e4, it's mate in 57. So it appears as though Carlsen hasn't really made any progress at all, as it's with best play, mate in 57 from this position. Remember, let me see, when did they start this endgame? I made a mess last time I was counting with rook and bishop against rook, so I better get it right this time. They started this endgame at move 50, and they're 14 moves in, and it's still mate in 57. But Carlsen has made some progress. And now, according to the table bases, knight g3 is still mate in 58. But knight g3 is a difficult move for a human to make, because the knight is moving away from the king and somehow seems to break white's defence. So it's a very counterintuitive move. King f1 played. Rook check. Now we get a little bit of shuffling here. And here, well, Vallejo played king d2. And that's a clear mistake. He should have played king f1. And at this point, put the king in the corner. So there's a really weird stalemate defense. From here, apparently it's mate in 22. Now, let me see. 19. I think that would be actually within the 50 moves. But let me just show you this stalemate defense. So if rook takes knight, then bishop d3. Oh, that's not stalemate. Heck. Oh, you see this stalemate? I'm going completely crazy. Yeah, it is. That's the stalemate defence. White's king has no moves. My head's spinning. My goodness. How do you think the players were feeling? Yeah, so that's the stalemate defence. So basically, Carlsen cannot take the knight on e2. This did not happen, by the way. But I think the thing is, this is definitely winning for black now, because the king is trapped in the corner and the king is able to come over to this side of the board. So it was still definitely winning. Whether Carlsen would have done it within the 50 moves is a moot point. Anyway, king f1 was the best defence. After king d2, it's not good for white at all after this, and bishop here. And now you can see that black's king is absolutely the right side. The king is forced back, and the king's in the perfect position, doesn't have to travel any great distance, and the king is in desperate trouble here. You can see rook check, and mate is threatened, and the king is absolutely fine on a3, and now it is completely over, and a nice move. So you can see the king is totally trapped. If white could magically remove those pieces from the board, it would be a draw by stalemate, but here white can still move. And I think that was that was the final move of the game. Move 73, and well, Carlsen had only played 6 hours, and here Paco Vallejo resigned. Let's just see what could happen. So bishop here, for example, bishop here, and bishop g7 on the next turn. Well, let's be melodramatic and play and pin, and then checkmate. So just 6 hours from Carlsen in round 2. I have to say, after the game, he looked pretty fresh. Another remarkable performance from him, really squeezing blood from a stone. Be interesting to see, how much energy he's got for the next game tomorrow, but somehow when you win, it's always worth it. In round 3, Carlsen plays against Anand. I bet Anand is going to wish that he spent more time in the gym improving his stamina when he sees what Carlsen was doing in the first 2 games. It's going to be very interesting. Anand actually won today. He beat Vincent Keimer, so he has 1.5. And Peter Svidler also has 1.5. He defeated Arkady Naiditsch. Thanks for watching. Join us again for another video after round 3.